As the prophet of esports, I rely on trustworthy and meaningful data every day. Data from our research partner YouGov offers the most complete view of esports fans and gamers in the world, providing context to who they are, what they think, the brands they buy, and things they do. YouGov's connected insights and research services inform strategy at every level. If you're a team, a brand, agency, or rights holder, you should be talking with YouGov. Their partners measure and maximize ROI and are telling compelling stories with data. Visit yougov.com/gaming-esports to learn more. This is way more serious. Actually, probably about as serious as it gets on this podcast.
Okay.
And this is an article about Tencent. The headline here is China's Tencent in talks with US to keep gaming investments. And the gist of the story is Tencent obviously owns Riot Games, and they own a big chunk of Epic Games. And they've been in talks with the Committee on Foreign Investment, which basically has the authority to force Tencent to divest these US holdings. And so now Tencent's essentially trying to work with this committee to figure out how they can keep these ownership stakes in these US game developers, right? So they own majority of Riot, or 100% of Riot, I think at this point, and a 40% stake in Epic. And there's real risk here for Tencent. Supposedly they have negotiated risk mitigating measures with the committee, and they're currently negotiating, to keep them. So, William, I'm curious your thoughts on this, without getting into any politics, obviously. But, could Tencent be in trouble at some point because of everything they have amassed, and so it starts to raise red flags?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really potentially significant problem for Tencent. I mean, it's an existential risk for their business, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you think about, like all the success that company has had in gaming, right? And let's be honest, it's had a phenomenal amount of success, particularly in the esports sphere of gaming. I mean, we basically, I think we pretty much, rightly or wrongly, impute real genius to Tencent, right?
Yeah.
At least certainly the success they've seemed to indicate genius. The reality is, there are existential risks to businesses like Tencent's. And one of them is, in this multinational heavy investment strategy, are you going to be allowed to, like, is government regulation a problem, right? Can government regulation come in and disrupt you? And it's weird for us to think about government regulation being an issue in video games, right? Because it sort of doesn't, it's like, video games, come on, like, government, like, what are we, we haven't done anything about loot boxes yet, like what's happening. But because of the value, I mean, you've seen just so many businesses we've talked about on the podcast achieving billions of billion-dollar valuations, right? They're such big targets, and they have so much foreign money coming into them because they're so, like, games are such a fungible global commodity, right? Like, you can launch, like, if you have a game that works in North America, chances are it'd probably be pretty good in Europe, Australia, Asia, everywhere, right? And the ability to diffuse that product is relatively easy too, because it's digital, right? So as long as you have internet in your home country, and yes, there's, localization and everything, but fundamentally it's much easier than, say, shipping cars around, right?
Yeah.
So the reality is it makes games, I think, even more of an attractive market for foreign investment because the product itself is so fundamentally decentralized, if you want to think about it that way, right? So yeah, it's scary, and I think Tencent, like, you gotta be worried because let me be clear. I don't think they're going to be forced to divest their ownership of Riot Games or Epic Games, right? I don't think that's likely. I do think what's interesting here, though, is what prohibition, strictures, or gives Tencent makes to U.S. regulators to be able to keep those positions in the companies. Because the reality is, once you're sitting down at the table, like, they're going to lose something here. I think something's going to be extracted from them. The question is, what is it going to be? And it's interesting to think, is it an opportunity for mirrored investment in, related domestic companies that are domestic to Tencent Smart? Like, that's an interesting option. It's interesting to think, are there going to be strictures in terms of the control they can exert on their, like US-based investments? That will be interesting, particularly in light of the fact that I wonder, there seems to be so much independence today from Riot Games and, and Epic, right? Like, makes you wonder if, maybe like control was never an issue, but maybe now it gets formalized, but it'll be very interesting to watch. I think it's going to be very important because Tencent's money is not most, I mean, it's a significant portion of the money driving the industry today. So whatever happens for them, it's going to dictate how they can invest in future as well. And this could actually have a cooling effect on some of the game stuff that we've seen.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. Like, do you think this makes them more gun shy or,
It's tough because you've had so much success with the strategy, right? Like, you've made so much money. Like, there's now a problem. And like I said, I don't think this is, though it's a potential catastrophic business risk, I would just be amazed if there's a forced divestiture or something here. It just doesn't seem likely to me.
Well,
right?
and what do you think they're going to have to give? What do you, like, if you had to, I know you threw out some options there, but what do you think, how do you think this plays out?
I just don't. It's difficult to speculate, but I think it'll be something to do about control and corporate governance, right? And a limited ability to influence companies. So maybe, an inability to vote some of their shares or something. I think that'll be a part of it. I also wonder if there's, I can't imagine it'd be much more than that. I can't even really see a cap being put in place on the ownership stake they could take or something for future investments, right? Both because, they, it doesn't seem to be how we do business today, but also it's very rare that they're buying 100% of things like Riot Games. Most of what they have is very significant, but still minority positions like what they hold in Epic. So I think that's right. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm curious. Do you think if any of this any of this conversation around, divesting these U.S. assets was accelerated by this news from last week that we discussed, where Valorant, a Riot Games game, Valorant voice communications are all being recorded, and maybe this raised some red flags. It's, hey, this is a security issue. We can't have the Chinese listening to everything we're saying.
Yeah. I mean, look, in general, I think games are a potential, games have an incredible, because they're just, think how often and also, by the way, think how much communication, you do through games, like, it's and game related, products, like we've talked about Discord in the past and how much Discord gets used for things, right? I think the reality though is, if you're going to be picking on businesses based on their control and monitoring, games might be a good place to start, but it feels like the mobile market is the place to really begin. I think it's probably the apps that are the higher risk, because let's be honest, like League of Legends is an amazing game and hugely significant, but its ability to know what I'm doing, I'm guessing, is far lessened than, say, the ability of, dozens of apps on my phone, which are basically designed around data collection. I'm not saying Riot doesn't do a lot of sophisticated data collection. I presume they do, as we've talked about on the podcast before. But, I think their ability to access, is more gated, I would imagine. So, yeah, I don't think it's related, but it would be interesting if it was. And it would certainly highlight sort of the regulatory scrutiny that's being placed in general on gaming. I think, by the way, has sort of had regulatory scrutiny due for it for a long time. I think when
you think it's overdue.
Overdue, yeah. I don't think it's going to be heavy regulation, but things like loot boxes, like, I'm still amazed we don't have movement there. You know what I mean? Like, again, it's a personal opinion, but it would seem to me something that you might want to look at least having some government guidelines for around this. I think games have just been for so long perceived as what kids play in basements and silly little industry, and we don't really, come on, that's, it's highways and airplanes, and but the reality is the money is so large now. Money attracts attention. I think there's going to be, like, my prediction for the back half of this year is we'll probably see more stories, not aggressive, scary stories, but more stories about things being looked at in the space, because I think there will be some changes here coming. What do you think, Paul? I'm curious. Like, what's your take on this? What do you think Tencent would have to give here?
Good question. Good question. I think I'm with you on, probably if anything, because I actually think there probably won't be anything. If I had to guess, I don't think there will be any repercussions here for Tencent. I don't think anything will change. I think this is mostly ceremonial, or like we have to make it seem like we're looking at it and we're thinking about it, and I really don't think they're going to end up with any kind of repercussions. And if anything, I'm totally with you on maybe it's a governance issue. I think the more interesting conversation that I like to sort of theorize about, or if I put my tinfoil hat on, right? If this does go through, right, and Tencent is forced to divest these assets.
What? That's really, I didn't even think about that, because I was like, that would not happen.
Where do they go?
Yeah. Well, what their whole strategy is, and what would that mean for the global gaming landscape, right? I mean, it would, probably, and this is a real reach, but it would probably be a return more to historical norms, right? If you think about how gaming used to be in the 80s and 90s, right? It was a lot more regionalized manufacture. You had things like Japanese consoles that were basically only had games made for them in Japan by Japanese companies, right? I mean, I'm extremely, simplifying there, but that's what immediately jumps to my mind. Like the PlayStation era, where it was like rare for, or like even early Nintendo era, right? It was rare for foreign developers to be producing a lot for Japanese domestic consoles. For various reasons, like the Nintendo Seal of Quality program or other things. I wonder if you wouldn't see more regionalization, again, as a result of that, because it's just tougher for money to be international. And funnily enough, I wonder if that might bring back more console exclusivity, like as a really strange knock-on effect. Because if you think about it, what you're really saying is development budgets are probably going to have to get smaller. They're going to have to be maybe more, there's going to be more risk because there's less money to flow into studios and things. You might want partnerships with, large platforms like an Xbox or a PlayStation to play the role of an investor almost and diffuse some of the risk. So it'd be interesting.
Yeah.
You might see us, I'm really reaching here to be interesting, but like one possible world, if you walk through that mirror of Tencent is forced to divest, one possible world we end back up in is the 90s. And another console war will be modern. It might be more platform based, all these other things, but that could be where you end up going.
Yeah, you may see more like smaller studios just in greater quantity also.
Exactly.
But I think the interesting thought is
multi-title studios and more of, sort of what it used to be where, studios had 1 to 2 IPs and, they were just focused on sequeling or paradoxically, I wonder if it might in some sense have more innovation in the industry, because again, there's sort of this trade-off with the more money that flows in, the more risk averse the industry gets because the more cost of failure goes up, right?
Yep.
So again, maybe thinking about the 90s and like Looking Glass Studios and Thief the Dark project might not be the weirdest world to think about. But to be very clear, I do not think it would be overall good for the industry to have a forced divestiture here. It would have a cooling effect. It would overall be very negative, and it might be some interesting knock-ons, and it's always fun to think about going back to the 90s and Gushers after-school snacks. That's my memory. So
what's interesting is who buys Riot in a divestiture situation, right? And the name I inevitably come to is it's got to be Activision Blizzard.
Well,
right? Because they're Tencent friendly.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Why not pass it along to a friend?
That would be the greatest. Paul, I refuse to think about that world because what does that mean for Heroes of the Storm?
Yeah, this is true.
What does that mean for Heroes of the Storm?
Maybe Heroes of the Storm gets a fighting chance at that point. I don't know.
No. I think what would happen is you'd start having Blizzard skins popping up in League of Legends, and Heroes of the Storm would be done. It would be scary. No, but you're right. That's really, but why wouldn't Riot go public in that world? Just to speculate.
Maybe.
That's
Possibly.
what I would suggest, because if I'm Tencent and if I'm Riot and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, look, like Activision Blizzard's a public company, like look how well, like it's our time, they're large enough. They have a multi-title suite, right? They're no longer, a one game company, right? Which they were for most of their history. They arguably have, and we thought sort of Riot might be preparing to go public on the podcast historically, right? Like we talked about that with their, big multi-game, long-term plan and, diversified channel strategy. They were doing all the things that made sense before a public offering. I would bet that rather than be acquired, they would go public, particularly with today's market and the valuations game companies.
I mean, that would be this would be a ridiculously hyped like IPO too, right? Like we're talking way bigger than Roblox, way bigger than, you know.
Yeah, well, not only that, but just think of what the Robinhood effect would have on this.
Everyone
Like,
wants to own League of Legends.
Yeah, the 100 million players who play League of Legends all decide they want to put in a week's allowance into the company. That's $1 billion of capital right there. You know, like right there, right? Assuming your allowance is $10 a week, which I don't know, maybe it's more nowadays. I don't know, or less. I have no idea. But I mean, that it's crazy. I mean, actually talking about it makes me wonder, like, why aren't they public? It would seem like they'd get, I guess, you know, the pains, the strictures of being a public company, but it seemed like they would get such a favorable reception in the market, right?
Yeah, but this is why, like, last week's news scared me so much, in the sense that being public invites scrutiny.
Yeah.
Right? When you're private and owned by Tencent, good luck like knowing what they're actually doing or what, right? So maybe they just don't want the public scrutiny either.
Well, you know, to some extent, and I'm not going to, I don't want to cast any aspersions here. I want to be difficult about how I phrase it, but like, I think the fact that Riot hasn't gone public sort of explains why Riot still makes very good games, right? Because I'm not saying you can't be a public company and make great games. Like, obviously, there are a million counterexamples to that, but it shows where the focus of the management team is, right? Like, and candidly, there are probably a lot of incentives to be public. But if your goal is to make the best competitive games, which I think is probably how Riot would describe their business model, right? You're right. You know, you have enough money, you're well funded, you're doing well, you don't actually need access to the capital, which is the big reason to go public, right? It might be more rewarding and more intellectually satisfying to stay private and have the flexibility and the control and all the things that you give up a little bit. So, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, you know, I'm not suggesting they're doing anything nefarious with the data, but you just don't want prying eyes. And because
like
they've looked at, you can look at Blizzard, right, and go, look what being public did for them. I mean, practically.
Well, you know, that's not. I don't want to go into the Blizzard conversation again, but I was looking at the.
They may look at it that way. If you're a developer, right? If you're just the guy, forget about management, forget about if you're just the guy making games, right? Yeah, you probably know people at Blizzard who are not happy. It's why you have this sort of exodus of people there, and you're going, maybe we're better off the way we are, where they don't care how long it takes. They're focused on making a good game, right? They have no shareholders to answer to every quarter. They don't have, right? It's There's a lot of upside to staying private.
There's huge upside to staying private, and particularly because at the end of the day, you know, I wouldn't describe Riot's goals as artistic, because even if many people in the company would, because I think it's more, I think of them less as artists and more as craftsmen, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Like, I think what they're doing is, like, they're just, you know, it's not like they're trying to do this crazy, you know, non-commercially. Like, they're honing this thing again and again and again. It's like a wood carver.
They're not trying to win Oscars.
Exactly.
Right? But they're going to build a really cool house.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think if you have that craftsman mentality where you want to bake titles for 10 years and cancel projects that you don't think are going to work out, and have random development teams work on things that never, you know, all the things that you kind of associate, like, I guess you could say the old Activision Blizzard with, right? You know, or the old Blizzard, right? Like, yeah, just why would you want to invite that whole situation? I mean, look at the headache that Blizzard's with right now with the launch of Diablo 4. Like, you know.
And Overwatch 2.
And Overwatch 2. Why would you want to invite that? Yeah. You know, nobody was asking for Valorant until Valorant just appeared. You know?
It's true. It's true. It's a good point.
But if they'd been a public company, the question would have been, where's the next game? Where's the next game? Where's the next game? We've been waiting. Guys, it's been 5 years. Come on. Yeah.
Yeah, you previewed whatever, that fighting game, you know, 6 months ago. We want it now. Where is it, right?
Yeah, and there's also the lesson of CDPR now, too, in the market, looking at this, which is, look, you know, you could have argued they were the model for a publicly traded auteur company. And, yeah, you know, Cyberpunk, I wonder would Cyberpunk have released when it did had they not been a public company trying to hit holiday sales? I mean, I'm
good point.
sorry to say it, but like
It's a good point.
you have to think that played a factor in it, you know?